Hi there, and welcome to the latest edition of Money Talks, where we take a look at all aspects of the rural economy as it affects you in the ag sector. According to KPMG, white-collar criminals in New Zealand ripped off $72 million in the past 6 months. It looks like we'll hit record levels for corporate fraud this year. But what about fraud down on the farm? What are the trends? How do you spot the danger signs? And what can you do to stop it? And who's about to cash in on the new free trade deal with Malaysia? Get those exports ready, boys and girls. If you're one of the lucky ones, there could be boom times ahead. Finally, is the government pulling its punches, backing off, making a tough call on the curly issue of foreign ownership of our farmland? All this and much, much more coming up. But first, U.S. GDP numbers aren't as strong as first predicted. How bad is it? What's it mean for us? Let's go to ASB rural economist James Shortall. James, great to see you.
Good to be here.
What does it all mean in the U.S., those low numbers?
Yeah, well, the GDP fell by about 3.5% in the first quarter, down to about 2.5% in this quarter through till June. So it's quite a sizable decrease, and I guess the numbers were the weakest in the household sector. It's no surprise. It's a very important part of the US economy, and just overnight we've seen further news out of the household sector. Spending has only just increased by 0.1%. Incomes are flat over the past month, and actually savings has gone up over the past month. It's at its strongest level over the past year. So all that does mean that the household sector in the US are pretty cautious, and with high unemployment, there's reason to believe that they're going to continue to be so.
There is talk, of course, of double-dip recession still. What are you picking?
Yeah, I'm not picking that there's going to be a double-dip recession.
You always say that.
But of course, we have seen a slowdown, and the results from 3.5 down to 2.5 indicates a slowing in the growth. So a recession, no, but a slowdown, then we're seeing that across the world. China the same.
Let's talk about China. Yeah, manufacturing numbers down. I mean, they've hit what, 12% growth so far this year. Is it all over for them?
Well, I think we're going to see slower growth, no doubt, out of China already. The first quarter, as you said, then growth was up around 12%. Second quarter down 10.5%. Probably over the next 6 months, then we're going to see it somewhere between 8 and 10. Remembering that, of course, China, their aim is to have growth of about 8% per year. So we've seen it pretty strong just recently. But really, they're going to continue to be a big growth industry for New Zealand agriculture. But that strength is going to be just a little bit down, I guess.
And everybody around the world is waiting to see how they put the brakes on, how the government slows down the growth. It's going to affect all of us. Talk to me about that.
Well, already the government's put restrictions on bank lending. Last year, they went out and told the Chinese banks to open up the books to get lending to businesses, to consumers, and they certainly did that. $1.4 trillion worth of lending. It's quite significant, and there's been a construction boom in China. There's talk of a bit of a price bubble in terms of the housing market coming up. So that is a bit of a risk, and if that happens, then that could have some big consequences. But already the government has told the banks to tighten up their lending. They've increased their core capital ratios. They've started to float the yuan recently. So they're making some changes to the Chinese economy in order to make it more sustainable long term, but also to tighten it up and make sure that there's not too much inflation going on.
Enough about the Chinese. Now it's all about us. How's the New Zealand dollar doing against the greenback?
Increasing. Unfortunately for farmers, we've gone up, and that has been a little bit about sentiment in the global marketplace. Equities last week were sort of up. They're mixed, but in general, US companies, their earnings results have been pretty strong. About 75 to 80% of the companies that have released their second quarter earnings have beaten market expectations, and that has been quite positive, I guess, for the New Zealand dollar. And currently we're trading sort of 73.40 against the US, which we've been increasing over the past few weeks.
The official cash rate, of course, since last we talked, has gone up. Are you still picking it to hit about 5%?
We are still picking it to hit about 5%, but the Reserve Bank, there was no surprise in them increasing it to 3%, but the big surprise came about with the tone of their statement. They sort of toned it down a little bit from June, and they sort of suggested that they might need to pause at some point in the future, depending on what's happening in the global marketplace. And where, now the market's actually pricing in that, we may see a pause at the next meeting or in October. We don't think that's probably going to happen. It's more likely to be later on in the year.
Okay, so listen, if you were the banker now and I was the farmer and came to you and said, I got mortgage repayments, I want to decide fixed or floating, what's your best advice?
Well, I guess it depends on everyone's individual.
Come on, don't hedge it. You're sounding like an economist here. Money where your mouth is.
There's going to be some benefits for short term, of course. Short term rates are going to stay low for a bit longer. Perhaps where the market is right now, we have seen interest rates at longer terms have edged back a little bit just because of that uncertainty about what the Reserve Bank's going to do down the track. So there does seem to be some opportunities around 2 or 3 years. But it's always going to depend on whether people are going to pay down some debt in that time. Everyone's circumstances are going to be different. Hey,
some good news for the beef sector now out of the US. What's going on?
Yeah, beef prices in the US have actually been increasing. They're looking pretty strong. They haven't changed a lot over the past week, and I think that's pretty good news actually, considering that they've increased, probably since the beginning of July. They have come back. They're higher than they were sort of last year. The dollar is eroding what that means to us here in New Zealand in New Zealand dollar terms, but the US market, of course, we have talked about calf numbers down, cow numbers down, I think over the next 2 to 3 years, and that's going to be positive for New Zealand beef farmers.
I'll tell you something else that's down, the dairy numbers out of the latest dairy global trade today. What's going on?
Yeah, those on a trade-weighted basis, those figures were down 8.3%.
Not good.
No, it's and of course I think of some concern is on the spot market. So for the product that is to be delivered over the next 3 months, and that was down over 13%. So there's no question that we've seen some softening in dairy prices recently. To be honest, we weren't expecting to see such a large drop. We have been expecting to see some price drops, but not such a large drop and as quickly as what we have. Prices are down about 25% just over the last 4 months, so that's a big drop.
Thanks, James. Next up, Ian Proudfoot, agribusiness partner for KPMG, who joins us to talk money matters at home on the paddock and around the world. But first, a question for you in our Farmers' Facts and Figures quiz. What's the average price tag for corporate fraud cases in New Zealand in the last 6 months? The answer right after the break. Stay with us. Welcome back to Money Talks. Just before the break, we asked you, what's the average price tag for corporate fraud cases in New Zealand in the last 6 months? The answer, more than $2 million per case. That's the latest word from KPMG's Fraud Barometer. The question, if corporate fraud is on the rise here in New Zealand, why isn't farm fraud, or is it? Joining us now, KPMG agribusiness partner Ian Proudfoot. Ian, thanks for being with us.
Thanks for inviting me.
How much farm fraud is going on out there? What are you picking?
Well, the amazing thing when we analysed the figures is there was no agribusiness fraud in the last 6 months. And that raised some sort of quite significant questions in my mind as to how such a significant component of the economy isn't suffering fraud.
What's going on that's changed the dynamics? Of course, most farm deals now are more complex, correct?
Yeah, and I think we're seeing a clear trend towards multiple farm ownership. So we're moving away from the model of one farmer, one farm, and that owner-operator model, to a model which requires a much greater level of corporate governance, because you've got multiple farms being controlled through a sort of management structure. And that sort of structure provides opportunity for people to commit fraud if you haven't got your internal controls right.
How much farm fraud do you suspect might be going on that's flying just under the radar?
I'd hate to put a number on it, but when I talk to clients and contacts, the normal question when I ask them, have you identified any fraud in the year, the question is, it's happening, we just can't find it, or we haven't found it yet. So I'm pretty sure that there's a reasonable amount of fraud out there, and to put a number on it would be difficult, but the trend says it's becoming a bigger problem.
Ian, who's typically stealing the money?
white-collar people. The general fraudster and our overall fraud surveys we do suggests it's a 46-year-old middle manager is normally the major fraudster, and that would tie back into a farm manager in an agricultural environment. Somebody that's been given a high degree of responsibility, that's had delegated authority to them, and potentially the mortgages become tight, it's tough economic conditions. There's an opportunity, and they see that opportunity. Once you've done it the first time, it generally becomes easier.
And what are the top ways that they're actually stealing the money? How does it work?
Easiest way is theft of cash. That's still the basic way we see most people doing it, and that's generally through fudging the ledgers and taking cash out of the bank account and posting entries to cover that. Other ways, backhanders. So doing a deal with a supplier and paying a slightly higher price, and then the supplier sharing that overpayment back to the individual. And one way we're seeing quite interesting in the rural sector is people taking advantage of points, loyalty points being earned through the rural supplies companies to buy products for their own use rather than necessarily using those for company purposes.
It all sounds perhaps a little penny ante stuff. Is it bigger than that?
It doesn't take long to become a big number. So yeah, I've personally had within my clients circumstances where those sort of overpayments to suppliers have racked up to multiple millions of dollars when they haven't been identified for a number of years. Incredible.
Okay, very quickly, before we move on to the next subject, what are the warning signs for farmers? What should they be watching for?
I think personally the key thing to be watching for is making sure that you're setting very clear budgets at the outset, particularly if you're operating more than one farm, and then you're understanding and the results of the farm and comparing those to those budgets on a regular basis. Waiting to the end of the year once you've had the accountant pull together the farm accounts is too late, because if there has been a fraud, the horse has already bolted and the money's gone. Recovery is very difficult, and a very low percentage of cash ever gets recovered. So constantly monitoring and being close to your farm, getting out on farm and talking, understanding what's happening.
The whole psyche of New Zealand too seems to be kind of an Alan Hubbard psyche, if you like. Everything's done on a handshake. Are you saying that we should change that now?
I think globally fraud is becoming a bigger problem. A higher proportion of transactions being undertaken electronically. All those things require better documentation. I think it's important that while we maintain those personal relationships are backed by proper documentation. And just be aware that New Zealand's probably not quite as honest a country as it was 10, 15 years ago.
Sad to hear. However, we might be a little richer, James, looking at the new free trade deal that's come on now with Malaysia. Who's going to really benefit big time?
Hopefully agriculture. I think dairy is the biggest exports through to Malaysia. It's it's a fast-growing economy, one of our major exporting destinations. So I'd read that they're expanding about 6.5% this coming year. So I think dairy, meat, logs, some of the core exporting industries for agriculture will benefit out of this.
Apparently, we made $750 million in exports to Malaysia last year. How much bigger do you think it could get over the next, let's say, 5 years?
I think that whole Southeast Asian area is absolutely critical to New Zealand, and the strategy the government's adopted of getting free trade agreements with as many countries as possible is really the driver to the future economic growth of New Zealand. How big could it get? I think it could become the majority of our exports. There's increasingly affluent consumers in those markets, and they want the products we can sell. They want premium, high-quality products.
But what do they want out of us? What are we going to have to be taking more of? It's